Ethan Hale moved like a wraith through the narrow, graffiti-streaked alley. His footsteps were silent, his breath controlled, and his presence all but erased as he hugged the building's edge, the shadows clinging to him as if he were part of them. His heart beat steadily, in sync with the city's dark rhythm, one he'd known intimately for as long as he could remember. Tonight, he had heard the cries for help, faint, desperate, echoing from blocks away. They were silenced now, but he had learned long ago not to ignore even the smallest sound in this city. Too often, they were the only signs left behind when predators in the night stalked their prey. He reached the mouth of the alley and paused, sensing movement beyond the dim streetlight's range. There, half concealed by the night, a figure was rifling through the pockets of a young woman slumped against a wall, her purse flung aside. The assailant glanced over his shoulder, sensing something was off, but it was too late. Ethan let the shadows pull him forward, his form almost blending with them as he closed in, silent as death. 1 second, he was mere darkness, and the next, he was right behind the man, his hand clasping the shoulder of the would-be thief. "Bad night to pick pockets," he murmured, his voice low but laced with danger. The man froze, then attempted to twist away, but Ethan tightened his grip, pushing him against the wall in a swift, fluid motion. He could feel the tension in the man's muscles, the fear in his rapid breaths. "Please, man, I didn't know. Take the money, and you'll find out," Ethan replied, his gaze hardening. The thief dropped the purse, scrambling to escape. Ethan let him go, watching the man disappear down the street before returning his attention to the young woman. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse weak but steady. She'd survive, though the encounter would leave her with a memory she'd likely prefer to forget. As he watched her for a moment longer, a familiar pang rose within him, an ache that reminded him how close he danced to the same edge as the predators he fought. He was a guardian, a vigilante, but one who hid within the city's shadows. No one thanked him, no one knew his face, but he had made his peace with that. It was better to be unseen. With a final glance, he faded back into the darkness, slipping through the city streets, searching for the next disturbance. But this time, there was something different in the night air, a tension he couldn't ignore. Days passed, and the city seemed to grow darker, not from a lack of light, but from a chilling atmosphere that seeped into its very bones. Crime reports surged, whispers of shadowy figures involved in robberies, kidnappings, and worse spread through the city. And each time Ethan investigated, he found eerie signs, graffiti and cryptic symbols, shadowy outlines scorched into walls, and a disturbing pattern of incidents that all pointed to something far more organized than simple street crime. His encounters grew increasingly strange. The criminals he faced were bolder, faster, and disturbingly proficient in using the shadows to disappear from sight. For the first time, Ethan felt as though he was chasing reflections of himself. It was in one such pursuit, at the scene of an attempted bank robbery, that he finally saw the face behind these incidents. Under the flickering neon lights of a downtown bank, Ethan spotted a tall, sharply dressed man with dark hair, observing the chaos unfolding in front of him. His expression was calm, confident, and disturbingly knowing, as though the havoc was merely a part of some grand plan. Ethan felt his muscles tense as the man turned and locked eyes with him, a faint, mocking smile playing on his lips. He gave Ethan a slight nod, then vanished into the shadows, as if they'd swallowed him whole. This man was no ordinary criminal. He was like Ethan. No, he was something darker. And as he learned later, this man had a name, Cassian Voss. The weeks that followed were an unrelenting battle for control of the city's night. Cassian's organization, known as the Veil, operated under a disturbing philosophy: those who could harness shadow power were meant to rule. Cassian claimed the city's dark underworld as his domain, and he was determined to make it his empire. The criminals under his sway were skilled, coordinated, and, worst of all, empowered by abilities eerily similar to Ethan's own. One night, as Ethan was investigating a recent crime scene, he encountered two members of the Veil. They were dressed in sleek, black combat gear and moved like specters through the shadows, each movement precise and deadly. Together, they were known as the Obsidian Twins, a pair of assassins whose skill with shadow manipulation rivaled his own. Ethan's breath caught as he realized they had surrounded him, blocking his only escape routes. "Didn't think you'd show up alone," one of the twins sneered, her voice low and venomous. Ethan smirked, masking his unease. "Figured it was enough to handle the two of you." With a nod, the twins launched their attack. Ethan ducked, shifting into the shadows as their strikes passed through the empty air where he'd stood. He moved quickly, but the twins were relentless, each one countering his maneuvers with chilling precision. It was like battling his reflection, a brutal reminder that he was no longer the only one with these abilities. After a tense and desperate struggle, Ethan managed to slip through their defenses, blending into the darkness just as he sensed them faltering. The twins hesitated, then retreated, fading into the night. But Ethan knew it wouldn't be long before they found him again. In the days that followed, he sought answers, determined to understand the extent of his powers and what gave the Veil their dangerous abilities. He found himself in old, forgotten archives, searching through ancient records of supernatural phenomena, cursed bloodlines, and tales of shadow-wielding sorcerers. And in one particularly obscure text, he found a name that sent a chill through him: the Shadow-Bound. According to legend, those known as the Shadow-Bound were descendants of an ancient clan cursed to dwell in darkness. Over generations, they had developed abilities tied to shadows, able to manipulate and even weaponize darkness itself. The curse was as much a gift as it was a chain, binding them to the shadows and preventing them from living fully in the light. Ethan shut the book, his mind racing. So this was his heritage, an inheritance that bound him to a life hidden from the world, always skirting the edges of society. But it also gave him strength, a bond to the shadows that others could only imitate. It was around this time that he met Maya Torres, a tenacious detective assigned to investigate the recent surge in shadow-related crimes. She had a knack for piecing together clues, and she was no stranger to chasing the city's mysteries. Their paths crossed when Maya tracked a gang of shadow-wielding criminals into an abandoned subway station, her sharp instincts driving her deeper into the dark. Ethan intervened just as she was about to be ambushed, pulling her into the shadows with him as the attackers searched for their prey. For a moment, he was acutely aware of her pulse racing, her breaths shallow. She was tough, but even she wasn't immune to fear in the presence of something so inexplicable. Who are you?" she whispered, her gaze wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He didn't answer, focusing instead on the attackers. But Maya wasn't easily deterred. She began piecing things together, noting his strange abilities, his familiarity with the criminals, and the way he moved as if shadows were a natural extension of his body. "You're like them," she murmured later, as they escaped into the night. "But you're fighting against them. Why?" He paused, her question echoing in his mind. "Because someone has to," he replied quietly, feeling the weight of his own words. It was a truth he had lived by, but hearing it out loud solidified his resolve. In the days that followed, Maya and Ethan formed an uneasy partnership. Her tenacity and resourcefulness complemented his powers, creating a synergy he hadn't anticipated. He'd worked alone for so long, but having someone by his side, a human ally, was strangely reassuring. For the first time, he felt connected, tethered to something beyond his own solitude. One evening, as they stood on the city's rooftop, Ethan opened up about the Veil and Cashin's plan to seize control of the city. Maya listened intently, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "Then we take them down," she said, her voice resolute. We hit them where it hurts. They spent hours devising a plan, using Maya's knowledge of the city and Ethan's understanding of the Veil's tactics. They knew Cashin's gang would be planning a grand heist soon, one that would cripple the city's financial infrastructure and mark the beginning of his rule. When the night of the heist arrived, Ethan and Maya were ready. They infiltrated the building where Cashin's gang had gathered, blending into the shadows as they moved. Ethan could feel the familiar pull of darkness, a reminder of his own heritage, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the mission. As they navigated the building's labyrinthine corridors, Ethan felt his heart pound, both from the thrill of the hunt and from a growing sense of foreboding. The time had come to face Cashin and bring his reign of terror to an end. The hallway was eerily silent, and Ethan's footsteps echoed faintly against the walls as he moved through the shadows with practiced precision. Maya was close behind, her eyes sharp and alert. They were deep within Cashin's domain now, the heart of the building where the Veil's top enforcers operated. The dim emergency lights flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows that seemed to pulse with life. Ethan felt his senses heighten, his connection to the shadows growing stronger with every step. The Veil's power base was no ordinary place. It thrummed with a dark energy that felt almost alive. They approached a security room, where two guards sat in front of an array of monitors, oblivious to the presence lurking behind them. Ethan held up a hand to Maya, signaling for silence. He reached out, letting the shadows envelop his hands, and within seconds, the darkness extended outward, snaking along the floor and crawling up the legs of each guard. Before they could react, the shadows solidified, binding them in place. The guards' muffled struggles were brief. Ethan moved swiftly, disconnecting the cameras and plunging the security feeds into static. Maya gave him a nod of approval, and they continued down the corridor, navigating the maze-like structure with a shared, silent determination. As they rounded the corner, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing man with a cruel smile stretched across his face. Ethan recognized him immediately. One of the Obsidian twins. The man's eyes gleamed with malice as he spread his arms wide, as though welcoming a long-lost friend. "Didn't think you'd come this far, Hale," the twin sneered, his voice low and mocking. "Cashin sends his regards." The fight began without warning. Ethan surged forward, and the Obsidian twin mirrored his movements, their shadows colliding in a whirlwind of darkness. Ethan's fist struck with precision, but each time he landed a blow, the twin seemed to dissolve into shadow, reappearing elsewhere with a ghostly speed. The hallway filled with the sounds of their clash, the air thick with the scent of ozone as their powers collided. Maya watched, her fingers twitching, ready to intervene, but Ethan caught her eye, shaking his head. This fight was his. He focused, drawing on every ounce of his strength, letting the shadows consume him, until he was little more than a silhouette, indistinguishable from the darkness around him. The twin hesitated, sensing the shift, but it was too late. Ethan lunged, his hand piercing through the shadows to grab the man by the throat. With a final, crushing squeeze, Ethan released him, watching as the twin crumpled to the floor, unconscious. He turned to Maya, breathing heavily but victorious. She gave him a brief, approving nod, and together, they pressed onward. The corridors opened into a large, industrial-style chamber at the building's core. The space was dimly lit, but it was filled with the hum of machinery and the low murmur of voices. Dozens of Cashin's followers moved about, preparing equipment and coordinating the final stages of the heist. At the far end of the room, Cashin himself stood on a raised platform, observing his loyal followers with a satisfied gleam in his eyes. Ethan's fists clenched as he took in the scene, his gaze fixed on Cashin. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. The man who had brought chaos to the city, who had turned Ethan's own powers against him, was finally within reach, but Cassion's eyes met his across the room, and he raised a hand, signaling for his followers to stop. The room fell silent as he descended the steps, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving Ethan's. Well, the city's mysterious protector finally shows himself, Cassion said, his voice smooth and taunting. I have to admit, I'm impressed. I didn't think you'd make it this far. Your little empire ends tonight, Ethan replied, his voice steady. I've had enough of your games, Cassion. Cassion chuckled, a low, sinister sound. Oh, Ethan, you still don't understand, do you? This city belongs to the shadows. It belongs to us. He extended his hands, and the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, coiling around him like serpents. Ethan could feel the pull, the dark energy thrumming through the air, but he steadied himself, drawing on his own connection to the shadows. He and Cassion stood at the center of a swirling maelstrom of darkness, each of them channeling their powers, each of them intent on emerging victorious. The fight was brutal. Cassion moved with a deadly grace, his strikes precise and calculated, each one aimed to exploit Ethan's weaknesses. Ethan countered with equal skill, his movements fluid and controlled, each strike infused with a determination that bordered on desperation. The room shook with the force of their battle, the machinery rattling as their shadows clashed in a storm of darkness. Cassion's followers backed away, watching in stunned silence as their leader fought against a rival who matched him blow for blow. Maya took advantage of the distraction, moving swiftly through the crowd, sabotaging equipment and dismantling weapons. She moved like a ghost, her presence barely noticeable amid the chaos, but her actions were decisive, crippling Cassion's operation from within. As the fight wore on, Ethan could feel his strength waning. Cassion was relentless, his power seemingly endless, and for a moment, doubt crept into Ethan's mind. But then he caught sight of Maya, her expression fierce and unwavering, and something inside him reignited. This wasn't just his fight, it was for the city, for the people he had sworn to protect, for the peace he had vowed to maintain. With a final surge of strength, Ethan let out a roar, channeling every ounce of his power into a single, devastating strike. Shadows erupted from him, surging forward like a tidal wave, and Cassion's smug expression faltered as he was engulfed by the darkness. When the shadows cleared, Cassion lay motionless on the floor, his followers staring in shock. The silence was palpable as Ethan stood over Cassion, his chest heaving, his body aching from the exertion. He looked around at the stunned faces of the Veil's followers, his gaze hard and unyielding. It's over, he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. The shadows belong to the city, not to those who would abuse them. One by one, Cassion's followers lowered their heads, their loyalty to their fallen leader broken. Maya stepped forward, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and relief. Together, they began the process of dismantling what remained of the Veil, ensuring that the city would no longer be plagued by shadowy crime. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the chamber, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. The city was safe, at least for now. But he knew that his work was far from over. There would always be darkness lurking in the corners of the world, always shadows waiting to be confronted. Maya approached him, a soft smile on her lips. You know, you don't have to do this alone, she said quietly. You could always work in the light. There's a place for you, if you want it. Ethan looked at her, the warmth of her presence a stark contrast to the cold darkness he had known for so long. For a moment, he considered it, the possibility of stepping into the light, of living a life where he didn't have to hide. But he knew, deep down, that his path was different. Someone has to guard the shadows, he replied, his voice soft but resolute. Someone has to be there, in the darkness, watching. Maya nodded, understanding in her eyes. They stood together for a moment longer, two allies bound by a shared purpose, before Ethan turned and melted into the shadows, his figure disappearing as the sun rose over the city.